Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I am the chosen one.
I am the chosen one.
This week, a diplomatic debacle over Trump's plan to buy Greenland.
Thought that the Prime Minister's statement that it was absurd, it was an absurd idea, was nasty.
Also this week, what are the Democrats going to do to the filibuster and the Supreme Court?
And the 1994 crime bill that's become a very hot issue in the 2020 election.
We urgently need the $1.8 billion in this bill to combat the epidemic of violence against women on the streets and in the homes of America.
Hasn't changed in 25 years.
All that and so much more. But first, everyone's favourite planet.
Well, it all began with a pretty ridiculous-sounding report that claimed that President Trump had been urging aides to find a way to buy resource-rich Greenland from Denmark. It turned out, though, it wasn't fake news.
Well, Greenland, I don't know, it got released somehow. It's just something we talked about. Denmark essentially owns it. So the concept came up, and I said, certainly strategically it's interesting.
And that led to reactions like this.
President Trump has talked to aides and members of Congress about possibly buying Greenland.
Yeah, of course he did. Of course he did.
And for a while, it even seemed like the president could see the funny side of it too, tweeting,
I promise not to do this to Greenland.
But then the Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, was quoted by the Danish press as describing Trump's suggestion as absurd and that Greenland is not for sale. Greenland is not Danish. Greenland belongs to Greenland. I strongly hope this is not meant seriously. Well, President Trump didn't like not being taken seriously. He abruptly cancelled a state visit for Denmark scheduled for early next month.
Thought that the Prime Minister's statement that it was absurd, it was an absurd idea, was nasty. I thought it was an inappropriate statement.
And he continued,
I thought it was a very not nice way of saying something. They could have told me no.
And President Trump went on to point out that he's not even the first American president to look at buying Greenland, and he is right. In 1946, Harry Truman looked very seriously at it, and a number of American presidents over the years have acquired territory through purchases from another country. In 1867, the US bought Alaska off Russia for about $7 million. In 1848, the US paid Mexico $15 million for territory including New Mexico, California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, and western Colorado. And in 1803, the US paid France $15 million for Louisiana. So the idea of buying Greenland isn't so stupid. Talking about it with reporters before talking about it with Denmark or Greenland, then cancelling a state visit that you announced before Denmark knew anything about it, forcing them to invite you, is unconventional to say the least.
Yeah, look, the principle of investing in Greenland, that's a reasonable one. I've been working on a piece for this show about the battle for the Arctic in a post-ice world. And it's not just Russia and America in the picture. China have this plan they call the Ice Silk Road, which goes straight through Greenland. You've got precious metals there, you've got uranium, and most of all, you've got rare earth elements, which China currently has 90% of. But Greenland has a fair few of them as well. And they're good for electronics, iPhones, computers, green tech. So you can see why China wants to lock them all up and why America doesn't want to let them lock it all up. Problem is, can you play the Greenland anthem, please? The people of Greenland is a people pursuant to international law with the right of self-determination. In other words, Denmark can't sell them even if they wanted to. So I'm not quite sure why Trump sooked it up for, and he did sook it up, because right after he whinged about how nasty the Danish PM had been, he tweeted about Denmark's NATO spending. So that is pretty transparent right there, and it was particularly poorly received seeing as Danish troops fought in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and 50 Danes died in America's wars. So not Trump's finest moment there.
No, although not his worst either. President Trump has been sending mixed messages on the US economy this week. As the China trade war and market jitters fuel more talk of a looming recession, he tweeted 7 times trying to pressure the Federal Reserve to cut official interest rates.
Where is the Federal Reserve?
He also flagged a temporary cut to payroll and capital gains taxes to help boost the economy, then retreated rather suddenly from that, and then blamed Democrats and the media for wanting a recession.
I think the word recession is a word that's inappropriate because it's just a word that the certain people, I'm going to be kind, certain people in the media are trying to build up because they'd love to see a recession.
I got to say, as someone who's spent the last few months noting the gathering signs of a recession on this show...
He was talking about you, yes.
He should be. Some people are really getting carried away with all the doom and gloom. That inverted yield curve thing that I referred to, that's been on the news recently as well, just signifies a recession sometime in the next 18 months, not tomorrow. And while I understand why people are nervous, Germany's on the brink of recession, the UK economy's shrinking, so's Italy's, so's Brazil's, the world economy is looking fragile, but America, at least so far, is still doing fine. This is America's unemployment rate added to its inflation rate. And they're both still incredibly low. Nothing to worry about there. What about investment? Is investment falling? No, not really. It's not rising, but it's pretty steady. And as for the real engine of growth at the moment, consumer spending, real retail spending per capita is increasing at pretty much the same rate as it has been for 5 years. Steady as she goes. So, at least so far, there's no need for people to twist themselves in knots. The question, though, is where will the economy be in 12 months' time?
That is a very good question. The Trump administration this week, meanwhile, announced a new regulation which could allow for the indefinite detention of illegal immigrant families, including their children, while they await a court hearing. The rule overturns the so-called Flores Settlement Agreement, which required children to be released within 20 days, and which the Trump administration has long regarded as a legal loophole. Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Kevin McAleenan, says the change will keep migrant families together by keeping them in detention together.
Our goal remains, as in the previous administration, to provide an expeditious immigration result while holding families together, which particularly benefits legitimate asylum seekers with meritorious claims.
Yeah, the administration says that family cases could be resolved within 3 months, but they could also take longer. I'd point to the average waiting time for all immigration cases, which is currently up to 713 days. Now that is what I call indefinite detention, which makes it a bit rich that on the very same day the administration announced this rule, they also announced they wouldn't be providing flu vaccines to migrant families in border detention camps, even though 3 children have died from the flu in detention this year. Why not? Because of the, quote, short-term nature of customs holding. It's not short-term anymore. But that is only if this rule actually happens. This rule will be challenged in court, and the district judge who'll review it is Dolly G.
Who?
Glad you asked. She's the woman who oversees the Flores settlement. In the past, she hasn't cut the administration any breaks on the Flores settlement, so I don't know why she'd start now. I don't think this is going to happen. Sorry, Stephen Miller.
You'll be very sad.
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
Joe Biden has aired his first TV commercial of the campaign cycle, highlighting his electability and his role in the Obama administration.
We know in our bones this election is different. The stakes are higher, the threat more serious. We have to beat Donald Trump. And all the polls agree Joe Biden is the strongest Democrat to do the job. No one is more qualified. For 8 years, President Obama and Vice President Biden were an administration America could be proud of. Our allies could trust and our kids could look up to.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
There's a bit to unpack in that ad, I think. Certainly Biden is leaning into experience and age. He's got that older, reassuring male voiceover, probably the only voice older than Biden's in all of America. And clearly he's trying to highlight his connections to Obama. He's pinning himself firmly to Obamacare rather than Medicare for all. He's being seen with African Americans and contrasting that, of course, with pictures of Trump and people with tiki torches. Meanwhile, in New Hampshire this week, potential First Lady Jill Biden made a pitch for pragmatism on behalf of her husband as well. Some thought of it as a bit of a gaffe or a lukewarm endorsement at best. Take a look.
Your candidate might be better on, I don't know, health care than Joe is. But you've got to look at who's going to win this election.
So, kind of an argument, go with your head over your heart, acknowledging that there might be more exciting candidates and more exciting policies around than Joe Biden, but he is the best bet to beat Trump. That is a bad ploy, of course, because as we discussed last week, that is what Democrats say in all those polls. Above everything else, they want a nominee who can win.
It's certainly an interesting tactic to run so heavily on your poll numbers, both in the ad and with Jill Biden's grab. Because if the only reason you give people to support you is poll numbers, then one or two bad results could completely pop your bubble.
Right.
But at least so far, those poll numbers are holding firm. There was an interesting result this week from a Fox poll. In head-to-head polling with Trump, voters who had a negative view of both Biden and Trump preferred Biden by 43 to 10. And the reason that that's significant is those are exactly the people that Trump cleaned up in 2016. The people who disliked both Trump and Hillary. In Michigan, he won them by 21. In Pennsylvania, he won them by 25. And in Wisconsin, he won them by 37. That was enough to win Trump the whole election. And now, the shoe's on the other foot.
That is intriguing. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren has again apologised to Native Americans for her handling of those DNA tests showing her family's heritage. Facing taunts last year from President Trump and disproven claims that she had used an alleged Cherokee or Delaware Indian background to further her academic career, Senator Warren released the results of that test late last year. Tribal groups then said her DNA only shows that she had a native North or South American ancestor between 6 or 10 generations ago, and that does not afford her Cherokee Nation citizenship. Well, last week, President Trump again raised the issue at a rally in New Hampshire, and he pondered aloud whether he'd attacked Warren on this a little too soon.
It's like Elizabeth Warren. I did the Pocahontas thing. I hit her really hard. And it looked like she was down and out. But that was too long ago. I should have waited, but don't worry. We will revive it. It can be revived. It can be right?
Another example of Trump's incredibly unfiltered stream of consciousness truth-giving in these rallies. Senator Warren maintains that her grandparents were forced to elope from Oklahoma back in the 40s because her grandfather's parents disapproved of him marrying a Cherokee. But in Sioux City, Iowa this week, Warren expressed her regret over her handling of the whole matter.
Like anyone who's being honest with themselves, I know that I have made mistakes. I am sorry for harm I have caused. I have listened and I have learned a lot.
She didn't just give them an apology, she gave them an incredibly long Native American policy, John. It's a 35-minute read. Look at this. Look how long this policy is. It is very, very, very detailed. I guess people can't criticize you if they're asleep. But hey, it's working. Warren is still very much on the rise. Her very favourable numbers, according to YouGov, are 10 points higher than anyone else's. And she has higher total favourables as well, even though she has 7 points more don't knows than Biden or Sanders do. Also, this week is the first time in this race that online news has mentioned Warren more than any other candidate. And it's also the first week that Joe Biden hasn't been the most mentioned candidate. And Bernie Sanders moved past Biden as well. So Biden may be staying to wear on some parts of the media. Elizabeth Warren's only concern came from Pew Research. They asked people if they were enthusiastic for multiple candidates or just one. And over 50% of Sanders supporters are only enthusiastic about Bernie. That is not a huge surprise. But what is more surprising is that Biden's supporters are almost as picky. And even more interesting is only 19% of Warren's supporters are enthusiastic about her alone. that tells me a much larger proportion of Warren's support is up for grabs if she has a bad week or two. So stay tuned, other candidates. John.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's look at some of those other candidates. Joe Biden still has almost twice as much support as Warren in second place. She's just ahead of Bernie Sanders in the average of polls. Kamala Harris continues to fade back in fourth on 7.4%. Then comes Buttigieg. In fact, all of the top 5 Democrats lost a bit of ground this week, with that support drifting to Beto, who's had a better couple of weeks. Booker and Yang also picking up a bit. Steyer and Williamson are also up a little to 1% each. Also worth noting as well that Julian Castro qualified this week for the next round of debates. Meanwhile, there was an interesting series of head-to-head polls between Democrats this week. Biden leads Bernie by 6 and Harris by 4, while Harris leads Elizabeth Warren by 5 points. Now, these matchups could be very telling next year at the point at which the race is winnowed down to the final 2, and that makes these next numbers particularly fascinating. Take a look. Bernie leads Harris by 7 and Warren by 6, but put Warren and Biden head-to-head. Everyone else is out. Warren wins by 2 points, all of which suggests to me that Warren and Sanders are still splitting the progressive vote, and up until the point at which one of those two drops out, Joe Biden is going to be very hard to catch, unless it's by somebody appealing to centrists like Harris or Beto or Buttigieg. Meanwhile, though, time once again to play
Guess Who Won't Be President?
And this week, another Democrat has dropped out of the presidential race. It's Washington Governor Jay Inslee. Oh, indeed. He built his campaign on the issue of climate change, helping to put it on the agenda for the first 2 debates. Last week, he claimed to have the 130,000 donors he needed to qualify for the next debates, but he couldn't get to 2% in the right polls. So far, while he's out of the race, he is not endorsing anyone.
Poor old Ousley. But now... And this week has been all about criminal justice. America makes up a little less than 5% of the world's population, but nearly 20% of the world's prison population. The federal prison population in particular has grown 650% since 1980, and get this, 1 in 28 children has a currently incarcerated parent. Enter the criminal justice policies of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, which have a fair amount in common. They both end a lot of things. Private prisons, cash bail, solitary confinement, the death penalty, prosecution of under 18s, all gone. They reduce mandatory sentencing minimums. They legalise marijuana. They reduce the numbers of homeless and mentally ill people in prison. Apparently, 14% of prisoners are mentally ill. They invest in rehabilitation programs for the 750,000 people who leave prison every year. And they increase funding support for crime survivors, as well as funding for public defenders. More than 80% of defendants can't afford their own lawyer. So that's how they're similar. How are they different? Well, firstly, Warren's plan repeals the 1994 crime bill, a bill that Bernie Sanders voted for. I'm sure that's not a coincidence. Warren's plan also creates a new criminal negligence standard for executives of major corporations that have committed crimes. Warren's encouraging civilian oversight boards to monitor police conduct, but interestingly, at the same time, she also focuses on mental and emotional health support for police officers, noting that for the last 3 years, police suicides have outnumbered line of duty deaths. Interesting. To Bernie Sanders, who has plenty of his own focus areas, his plan ends 3 strikes laws. It ends police profiting from seizing suspects' possessions through civil asset forfeiture. He creates a whole prisoner's bill of rights with the right to vote, the right to healthcare, education and a living wage. He bans the use of facial recognition by police, which we'll be revisiting in future weeks. And biggest of all, he sets a goal to halve the prison population. Now, I don't know if that's just federal prison, which accounts for 12% of prisoners, or if that's for all prisoners. If it does include state prisoners as well, I have no idea how he plans to do that. He doesn't say. It seems to me a little bit like Sanders might be trying to live down that 1994 crime bill vote. But to be fair to Sanders, he wasn't wild about that bill, even at the time.
Yeah, although Bernie did at the time and even now defend some aspects of that bill. It was a big one. It had things like the Violence Against Women Act in it. Joe Biden, of course, because he was one of the key authors of it, he spends a lot more time defending a lot more of what's in it. But there are these criticisms like it was responsible for the mass incarceration of minorities. There are also criticisms that say, you know what, it didn't do very much to reduce crime, even though it went down in the 90s and 2000s. So, of those criticisms, what are really warranted? In the United States in the early 1990s, crime seemed to be everywhere.
All right, hands up, Porky. That's it. Now, give me your wallet, huh? You got it in here, huh, fat boy?
But it was no joke. There were 2,234 murders in New York City alone in 1990. The Big Apple was dirty and dangerous, overwhelmed by crack cocaine and street crime. Some Americans viewed drug crime as a result of an increasingly permissive society, and for years, Democrats had been defined as being too soft.
Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison.
Following the election of Bill Clinton in 1992, fellow centrist Democrats like the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Joe Biden, were determined to change that perception.
We have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them.
Senator Biden was a lead author on the sweeping 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which included an assault weapons ban, which we looked at last week, and it also included the landmark Violence Against Women Act, which helped overcome reservations about the broader bill from the likes of then Congressman Bernie Sanders.
Mr. Speaker, I have a number of serious problems with the crime bill, but one part of it that I vigorously support is the Violence Against Women Act. We urgently need the $1.8 billion in this bill to combat the epidemic of violence against women on the streets and in the homes of America.
The bill needed bipartisan support to pass Congress, and so it became a grab bag of left and right-wing priorities. It allocated federal funds to crime prevention and diversionary programs, paid for 100,000 extra police and more than that number of new prison cells. Money for new prisons was linked to truth in sentencing laws, requiring prisoners to serve at least 85% of their time. The Act included a federal three strikes law with mandatory jail for third-time offenders, and also added 60 new federal death penalty offences, including drive-by shootings and carjackings resulting in a death. It was a compromise. Biden and Sanders voted in favour of it, and President Clinton was happy to sign it into law.
And let us go forward, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, law enforcement, community leaders, ordinary citizens. Let us roll up our sleeves to roll back this awful tide of violence and reduce crime in our country. We have the tools now. Let us get about the business of using them.
And city officials like Republican Mayor Rudy Giuliani in New York did exactly that, increasing the size of the police force and, guided by the broken windows theory, cracking down on small crimes in the belief that you'd also reduce major crime as well.
You've got to pay attention to somebody urinating on the street. It may be a minor thing, it may be a serious thing, but you cannot ignore it. You have to deal with it. It is against the law to urinate in public.
And crime did go down. A lot. Murders fell 50% in New York City in just 2 years.
People find us more approachable than in the past. It's helped us solve a lot of crimes, especially homicides.
And suddenly America's big cities were looking better. After recessions in the late 80s and early 90s, the US economy was booming again, fueled by some new computery thing called the internet.
In 1995, some 10 million people regularly used the internet. What's attracted many of them is the World Wide Web, with its proliferation of special interest truck stops called websites.
But safer streets came at a cost. Not just the billions being pumped into law and order, but nationally, the prison population doubled over the next 15 years, disproportionately affecting blacks and Latinos. Mass incarceration in the United States began to escalate dramatically in the 1970s and 80s, so the 1994 Act and its proponents like Joe Biden are not necessarily completely responsible for that. It had more to do with the war on drugs, which began under Richard Nixon in the early 70s.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
But similarly, experts don't give the crime bill and extra incarceration more than a modest role in the falling crime rate. Nor do they think that cracking down on minor crimes or truth in sentencing made much difference either, although they agree more visible police on the streets, backed up by computer-assisted police methods, played a part in reducing property crime, at least.
Get your hands up, turn around.
A quarter of a century after the passage of the crime bill, rates of most offences, including homicide, are still down around 50% overall. The jury, though, is still out as to why. Is it social, technological, economic or environmental? We talked last week about theories linking reduced lead levels and legalised abortions to lower crime rates. Others suggest it's simply down to an ageing population growing out of crime, and others again claim reduced alcohol consumption, including by pregnant mothers, has made a big difference. But until we know exactly what has made the crime rate go down, we can't know how to stop it going up again. After all, it's happened before. Whether it's a pledge to introduce Medicare for all or ban automatic weapons, there is a big asterisk next to a lot of the promises being made by Democrats running for president. Under current Senate rules, if the tactics employed by Republicans under the last Democratic president are repeated next time, it's going to be very hard to get very much done at all. The reason? The use of the Senate filibuster, a rule which allows a minority of senators to stop a bill ever reaching a vote. In effect, that means that a majority of 51 out of 100 senators is not enough. You need a supermajority of 60 votes to get something passed. President Obama briefly had a supermajority in his first term. He used it to pass the Affordable Care Act and economic stimulus and a bailout of the auto industry, all over Republican objections. Now, frustrated at Republican obstructionism, the Democrats then abolished the filibuster for things like executive branch nominations, most of them at least. But that move came back to bite them after the election of a Republican Senate majority in 2016, which has since allowed President Trump a pretty free hand to stack the courts with Conservatives. But on bills requiring 60 votes, Democrats have been just as obstructionist in return. Democratic presidential candidates, though, are divided as to what to do about the filibuster. Elizabeth Warren says she has a plan.
And we should get rid of the filibuster.
Short plan.
It is. Pete Buttigieg also says just scrap it, and it can be done with just a simple rule change, with a simple majority, but Booker, Harris, Gillibrand and Sanders are not so keen.
I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that all those candidates defending the filibuster are senators. Senators kind of like it.
It builds in an excuse not to do something. Well, Gregory Koga is author of Filibustering, A Political History of Obstruction in the House and Senate. He is also a former legislative assistant to the US House, these days associate professor at the University of Miami. Dr. Koga, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
Why does the filibuster even exist?
So the way I approach it is that any legislature will allow some sort of filibustering. So the question is, will the legislature get rid of it when it pops up? In the United States Senate, the tradition has developed over the course of a century, and they just never got rid of it because they liked the effects that it had upon their decision making. Allowing a minority of the legislature to block some pieces of legislation helps to moderate outcomes and make sure that the country isn't lurching too far in one direction. And it helps to prevent the majority party from pushing something through a legislature based on sort of a lot of party pressure and manufacturing majority when really most members of the legislature privately think that a piece of legislation is a bad idea. It's a tradition that developed, and members of the U.S. Senate felt like the benefits were greater than the costs for most of the last century.
It's had a pretty bad reputation back to the filibusters of the civil rights era. Is it being abused?
Well, absolutely, it's been misused and abused throughout its history. I mean, allowing a few senators to block legislation, or now it takes 41, but historically it could be as few as 10. That's giving a lot of power to a minority of the legislature, and that power can be used to prevent terrible legislation. It can be used to prevent really beneficial or necessary legislation. So it's when you make a choice of a rule like that, you are allowing some people to abuse it if they use it the wrong way.
What would you say have been the biggest sliding door moments for the filibuster? What laws would have passed if the filibuster never existed?
One issue that's in the news right now is gun control. And in 2013, the Senate debated gun control right after a preschool was shot up. The major proposal that came up in the Senate at the time got 56 out of 100 votes, which of course is a majority, but it's not enough to get past the filibuster in the Senate. And that particular bill would have had problems passing through Congress anyway, but the fact that it couldn't get through the Senate then has been a looming fact for gun politics for the next 6 years, because every senator just throws up their hands and say, look, I mean, it's impossible to get the votes to pass any real gun control legislation, so why should we even try? So that's one example. But another way to think about it is not just like which bills passed or didn't pass, but what kind of legislation passed or didn't pass because of the filibuster. So when the United States was having a major debate over health care policy, 2009, 2010, the House of Representatives passed its bill that was fairly progressive in American terms. And then when it got to the Senate, it got watered down. The funding for the bill was shifted so that it came in part from labor unions, and the number of poor Americans who would get health care from the government was reduced in the Senate, again, to satisfy moderate senators. And the option for the government to compete in the healthcare market and to offer its own insurance program was deleted in the Senate. So the most important piece of legislation in the United States over the last 10 years was significantly minimized by the fact that in the Senate they needed a supermajority of 60 out of 100 senators instead of just 51.
Now, Democrats blame Mitch McConnell for the filibuster paralysing the Senate. Is that fair? And how did Democrats under Trump compare to McConnell's work?
I think it's somewhat fair. I mean, right now, a lot of people talk about how there's a high level of partisanship in American politics. But that's been going on for about 3 decades. So when Mitch McConnell was the minority leader under President Obama in 2009 and just said, why would we cooperate with you? Why would we let anything pass? That was a novelty. I mean, that was a new strategy to just have a blanket opposition to the agenda of the majority party and a newly elected president. That was new. So is it fair to blame Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader? Yes, because previous Republican leaders had not done the same. At the same time, Mitch McConnell is chosen by the members of the Senate Republican Conference. They could pick a different leader if they wanted to. So on some level, they like this strategy and they are responsible for it. How do the Democrats compare facing Donald Trump? It's hard to say. For the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, Republicans had a majority in both the House and the Senate, but Mitch McConnell, he seemed to anticipate that the Democrats would filibuster any major legislation. And so if you look at what the Republicans tried to accomplish in the first 2 years, almost all of it was legislation that could not be filibustered. When they tried to rewrite America's healthcare laws, they did it under a special budget procedure that couldn't be filibustered. When they rewrote America's tax laws, their one major piece of legislation on the Trump agenda, that was also passed as budget legislation, so it couldn't be filibustered. Otherwise, they used another special procedure to overturn Obama-era regulations, which couldn't be filibustered. And they focused a lot on approving new judges, which can't be filibustered as of 5 years ago. So it's hard to say what the Democratic strategy is or would be, because Mitch McConnell is just not putting bills on the floor of the Senate which can be filibustered for the most part.
Ultimately, do you think that Democrats will change the filibuster rule if they win in 2020?
First of all, I think what it would take is a Democrat winning the presidency and then the Democrats winning a majority in the Senate. Otherwise, it's not in their interest to tinker with the rules of the Senate. So assuming those two things happen, I think it's more likely than not that there be some sort of fundamental reform in the Senate. It does seem to depend a little bit upon who the Democrats nominate. So former Vice President Joe Biden, he's generally considered a more moderate option among the Democratic candidates. And that includes moderation in terms of tactics. So if he is president, I get the impression that he will not be leading the charge to reform the Senate. Whereas if it's somebody more progressive, like a Senator Kamala Harris of California or Elizabeth Warren, I think they will prioritize making sure that the Democratic agenda gets through Congress, and that'll include backing some major changes in the way the Senate works.
Gregory Koga, thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Look, I can't see the Democrats finding 51 votes to overturn the filibuster anytime soon, but Bernie Sanders has an alternative suggestion. We've spoken before about reconciliation, where you only need 51 votes to pass a bill under certain special conditions. The referee for those conditions is a lady called the parliamentarian. She advises the vice president, who is the presiding officer of the Senate, about what the majority can and can't do. So, Sanders' suggestion is to say the vice president is the ultimate person who decides, and my vice president will decide that my bills are fine to pass. In other words, Sanders will just pass whatever he likes, regardless of what the parliamentarian says. Now, in my view, that's as good as getting rid of the filibuster anyway, but you can see what our interviewee had to say about that in the extended interview on our Facebook page. But in the meantime, let's say you do get a bill through the Senate. The next step is getting it past the Supreme Court, something the Democrats aren't so confident about either. So, enter a whole bunch of new tactics. To the wall!
Big, beautiful wall.
Okay, first of all, what is the problem with the Supreme Court? Some say Supreme Court justices have become too partisan, but this is the Supreme Court ideology chart here. That's left, that's right, and have a look. Clarence Thomas is no more extreme than Rehnquist was, and Ginsburg and Sotomayor, they're no more extreme than John Paul Stevens was, or Marshall was, or this Douglas character here. I'm not sure what the story with Douglas was. But the point is that justices often have partisan opinions. What's changed is there's no more swinging middle-of-the-road median vote. The last 60 years or so, the public have been more or less accepting of these three justices, often being the deciding vote on the Supreme Court. But now, they've all gone. And you know who was the median vote in the last Supreme Court term? Brett Kavanaugh. It's fair to say that Democrats don't trust him very much. Catchy. So Democrats don't trust the court anymore, and that is why they want to fix it. And if 70-something Clarence Thomas dies under a Democratic president, then it'll be 5-4 the other way, and then the Republicans will want to fix it. So let's look at some of these fixing proposals, shall we? First solution, term limits. This is what Beto O'Rourke and Julian Castro want to do. 18-year terms for the Supreme Court. One new judge every 2 years. That would certainly solve two problems. First, it would stop presidents appointing younger and younger justices, because there would be no point, and it would stop judges from clinging on well past their use-by date until they are as good as dead. It would also lower the stakes of each confirmation, because appointments would only be for 18 years, not 40. And finally, it would create some kind of consistency. No luck involved, you elect a president, you get 2 Supreme Court justices. But would it require a constitutional amendment? Because the Constitution says that judges shall hold their offices during good behaviour. Does that mean only until they choose to leave? Some say yes, some say no. So that might require an amendment. Next problem, 2 words, Merrick Garland. What happens if the Senate won't confirm a judge during a 2-year period? I don't know, and that's an issue. And finally, this doesn't actually do anything to stop partisan judges, does it? It just shortens their tenure. Although there is a different way of limiting judges' time on the court.
What I do think may make sense is, if not term limits, then rotating judges to the appeals court as well. Letting them get out of the Supreme Court and bringing in new blood.
Okay, so the Sanders solution sounds nice. No limitations, lots of flexibility, but it does remove judges' independence, because the president can rotate a justice off anytime they'd like, presumably, and surely every president's just going to rotate onto the court 9 of their preferred judges. So I'm not sure that's the solution for partisanship. Oh, and it probably needs a constitutional amendment as well. So given all that, why don't we stop pretending and just fully embrace partisanship with court packing? After all, the Constitution doesn't specify how many justices the Supreme Court should have, so according to Andrew Yang, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren and Kirsten Gillibrand, the Democrats should just add a few extra justices to the court. as Elizabeth Warren put it, it's not just about expansion, it's about depoliticizing the Supreme Court. Yeah, I don't see that. But it would certainly fix what is bothering Democrats. And it could be done with a simple vote. But I'll let Cory Booker make the obvious response.
If the Democrats add people when we have an alignment of power, and that's the totality of our reforms, then be clear that the Republicans are going to try to do that as well. And you could end up with a day that our grandchildren one day ask us, hey, Granddad, why are there 121 people on the Supreme Court?
Okay, so this is a very temporary solution. If the problem is excessive partisanship, this would only make the problem worse. In fact, it would almost certainly destroy the entire legitimacy of the Supreme Court, and Republican officials may well just start ignoring court rulings altogether. Then you have a real constitutional crisis on your hands. Oh, and it's a very unpopular idea as well. Court packing's already opposed by 51% of the population. They haven't even started talking about it yet. And it's opposed, by the way, by a Democratic hero. So what about court packing light? The FDR model. Franklin Roosevelt, you see, talked a lot about court packing. So much so, he didn't even need to do anything about it. The threat of court packing alone forced the resistant Supreme Court to cave, and they gave him agreeable rulings. Today, 80 years later, some Democrats are trying the same trick, sending the court legal briefs that say things like, the Supreme Court is not well. It should heal itself before the public demands it be restructured in order to reduce the influence of politics. That there? That's a threat. And look, at least it's not court packing, but threats can easily backfire. And this also chips away at the legitimacy of the court, possibly making its politicisation problems worse. You know what we need? We need a kinder, gentler, more Buttigieg kind of court packing. Pete's got an idea. He proposes 5 judges be picked by Republicans and 5 judges be picked by Democrats. And then those 10 get together and choose 5 neutral justices. Now, at least that's not a partisan power grab, and it guarantees that they'll permanently be middle-of-the-road judges. But what happens if the partisan judges can't agree on who to pick? Well, if they don't pick 5 neutral justices and the Supreme Court doesn't make its quorum and it doesn't meet at all. So therefore, the Supreme Court will never meet again. That's a problem. But also, this explicitly labels 2/3 of the Supreme Court as biased. Is that going to depoliticize the Supreme Court? Also, it's very anti-democratic. This system guarantees that there'll never be a left or right-leaning court ever again, no matter how many decades people might vote for one. And what happens if one day there's 3 major parties? How does that work? Oh, bloody Buttigieg! Oh, I need to lie down. Oh.
Big, beautiful world.
And with that, we're right out of time for another trip to Planet America, Chaz.
No, you don't get off that easy, John. No, we're going to sit here and we're going to talk for another 45 minutes and then we're going to slap it on IG, YouTube and Facebook. Right
Kill
there.
me now.
See ya.
Bye-bye.